Hi, I'm Megan Van Emon, Extension Beef Cattle Specialist with Montana State University, and I'm based out in Miles City, and today I'm just going to talk a little bit about what kind of projects we have going on here in Bozeman at the Bozeman Agriculture Research and Teaching Farm. Right now we're on a water quality study looking at both salt and sulfate concentrations due to the water quality issues we mainly see in the eastern side of the state and causing those toxicity issues and lowered performance in our beef cattle. So our salt study is here on my left, and we're looking at different concentrations of salt in the water. So we have our control, which is basically a 0 parts per million salt, 1,000, 2,000, and 3,000 parts per million salt. We're also feeding them a low quality forage, roughly 6% protein, and then we're looking at a self-fed supplement. We are limiting that supplement to 2 pounds a day. We're in our first period right now. We're just completing that. Today we'll be doing some rumen evacuations to determine dry matter contents of the rumen. We have collected liquid kinetics data over the last 24 hours to determine liquid passage rate. And then we're also going to be looking at different digestion parameters such as dry matter digestion and fiber digestion. Now on our right, we have our water sulfate concentrations, which is our control again, same water source as our control salt. And then we have sulfate concentrations of 700, 1400, and 2100 parts per million sulfate. We are creating those water quality issues by mixing a sulfate or a salt source with the water. And that is to basically mimic those water quality issues we are seeing in the eastern side of the state. These animals, once they end period 1 today, will then move to a different treatment for periods 2, 3, and 4. So all of our animals will experience the different water concentrations, so we can then assess the digestion parameters and how that's impacting our rumen function. We've done a total fecal collection for 6 days, so that means our graduate students, Shay Larson, McKay Knack, Marley Manukian, and Noah Davis have been out here to collect those samples, and then we have an excellent undergrad worker, Janessa, who is out here as well helping those grad students with all these collections because the chromium EDTA, which is our liquid kinetics marker, is done over a 24-hour period, collecting samples every 4 hours, starting at 7 a.m. and ending the following day at 7 a.m. McKay Knack is doing the water salt concentration study, and Shay Larson is doing the water sulfate concentration study. So we have 2 graduate students working on their master's degrees with those projects, and those projects, the water sulfate and salt project, should wrap up in September, late September, and they will be analyzing all of that data that has been collected. Each cannulated animal has a rumen bolus in them right now by Smacks Tech, looking at rumen pH, temperature, and then overall activity of the animal throughout the day. And we will be showing that bolus to you later on in the day when we're doing our rumen evacuations, which is where we basically remove all the rumen contents from our cannulated animals. We weigh them, we collect samples, and then all of those rumen contents are then placed back into the cows. And that is to determine dry matter capacity of those contents and the rumen, as well as fiber contents, and then looking at those digestion parameters. So we have a second study that has already been completed this spring and summer, and that is our supplement study looking at a distillers-based supplement versus a more rumen-degradable protein supplement. And that was also using these 16 cannulated animals, and that study was completed at the beginning of the beginning of June. And Marley Manukian was the student on that study, and she has completed that project. We also have an intake and grazing study currently ongoing out at our Fort Ellis Research Center, which is a part of our Bozeman Agriculture Research and Teaching Farm on the east side of Bozeman. I'm sure if you've been traveling on the interstate and if you look off to the south, you might be able to see our Smart Feed Pro trailers out there for that intake study. And basically what we're doing is we're comparing a rumen degradable source of protein versus a rumen undegradable source of protein on those intakes to look at intake variation. And then we coupled that here with these cannulated animals, looking at both the rumen degradable and undegradable proteins in a block form and then also a loose form. So the block forms were fed as fed. They had no limited intake on those, and then our loose form we limited to 2 pounds of intake per day, and that is mainly to mimic the optimal amount of that protein that those animals would consume on a daily basis. Now, I will say they are in a dry lot situation here, so they don't have a lot of other things that they're doing. So we did have some very increased intakes above our what we would expect intake on those blocks that were on a self-limited type supplement, with a salt and a hardness of those blocks. So we did see some increased intakes there. We are again looking at rumen parameters in those animals and looking how digestion might be affected with a low quality forage, that same 6% protein forage as the water quality study. So very high fiber, and then supplementing with that protein source. Now, it's not very common that we're feeding protein supplements during the summer months, during that lush green grass period. However, with our heifers and our 2 and 3 year olds in our intake variation study, we are seeing some really good intakes right around that optimum amount, overall average of really 3/4 of a pound to 2 pounds a day out on our intake variation study. And we'll be looking at performance parameters as well as intake variation of those heifers and those 2 and 3 year olds with calves at side. And we're also measuring calf body weight to determine if there's any influence by those proteins on the calf.
Hi, my name is Sam Wyffels, and I am part of the Northern Ag Research Center, and I'm working with Megan on this water quality study. And as she mentioned, each one of these cannulated animals has a rumen bolus, which is here. And this bolus has, as we'll discuss later, sensors in it that measure each animal's activity, temperature of the rumen, and the rumen pH continuously throughout the whole period of the trial. So every 10 minutes, this bolus takes a measurement and tells us what the rumen conditions are like, and then it connects wirelessly to a base station so we can actually get online and look at real-time data at how these animals are rumen conditions change throughout time. And then with that, we can coordinate that back to water intake and how these animals are drinking and look at how that impacts the rumen conditions. So as Megan mentioned earlier, each animal has been fixed with a bolus that's placed in the rumen, and this bolus measures the pH, temperature, and activity of that animal throughout the whole period that they're under water quality trial. And so this is a graph of the output. So as you can see at the top in the green, we have pH. And so we can look and see how these animals' pH, or rumen condition pH, has changed over time. With those animals being in a grow safe, we can actually look at how the pH may change over time in response to a watering event with these different water qualities. In other studies, we've actually tried to correlate this, or went back and correlated this to actual feed events in feedlot studies. So we can look at concentrate intake, how that changes pH corresponding to feeding events. When we step down to the blue line in the middle there, that's temperature. This a lot of times correlates back to drinking, so we can actually look at drinking events. So when you're looking at that temperature, there's a dark line there that is the general average temperature of the animal's rumen, and then each one of those big dips that you see is a drinking event. We're actually going to try to look at this and correlate it to the animals in the grow safe and see if we can actually determine how much those animals are drinking based on the relative temperature change of that rumen. And then finally at the bottom is activity. And so each one of these boluses have an accelerometer in them where they're measuring the general activity of those animals, where spikes indicate increases of activity and the valleys are decreases in activity throughout the entire day or the entire period that those animals are under trial.
So Shay is taking chromium EDTA samples for liquid kinetics for a water study that we're completing right now for period 1. And what he is doing is he is suctioning out rumen fluid that he will eventually process so we can measure chromium concentrations throughout the day. We started at 7 a.m. with our initial dosing. Then he'll end up tomorrow at 7 a.m. for a 24-hour sample to determine how fast liquid passes through the rumen and is excreted. So we are wrapping up our rumen evacuations, and we've removed all of the rumen contents from these animals. We've weighed them and collected samples for dry matter and fiber, and we are now placing all the contents back within the rumen. The boluses will go in as well, and those will settle back into the reticulum to continue taking our pH, activity, and temperature measurements. These animals will then start period 2 here in a few days. I would just like to take a moment to thank our funding sources. The Bear Ranch Foundation provided funding for our water sulfate and salt project, and Sweet Pro Feeds has provided funding for our rumen degradable and undegradable protein project. Thanks, and I hope you enjoyed our video.